I'm going to try and give you some interpretations tonight, because interpretation of history is always dynamic, and interpretations change. Oscar Wilde once said that truth is just the opinion that has survived. He also said that truth is rarely pure and never simple. And as we talk tonight, I think there'll be some things that you question, and that's my purpose. My idea coming here tonight is to have you look at some of the things that you've believed for so many years and wonder if they really are true. History takes time to develop, and that's why we're talking about 100 years ago. But memory of the past tends to be very politicized. So a lot of the things that we think that we know are things that we were told were true, but we have to wonder if they are. With every new book that's written, you add or you subtract. Sometimes you change the narrative. And also we have to put our own morality into the things that are written. And we have to try and look at the morality from 100 years ago. So it's this questioning of accepted narratives that really gives new evidence and new interpretations. And that's what I'm going to try and do for you tonight. So the years moving from the War of Independence through the transition to the new free state, etc., this really deserves a closer look, and we'll try and do that tonight. We'll talk about terror throughout the whole period and how uncomfortable it is to look at terror during the period of time. I'm going to talk about the treatment of women specifically during the period and thereafter as well. And then I'm going to question really whether there was a revolution. I'll talk about a few things here in Kilkenny, but there's no way that I could tell you any more probably than you know about Kilkenny. But as Anne said, I was a soldier when I was much younger, and I spent most of my working life as a lawyer. So I look at things a little differently than an academic. I look at them as a soldier or as a lawyer, and I'll do that tonight. One of the things about a lawyer is a lawyer does not provide proof. A lawyer simply gives out evidence. And what I'll do with the things that we discussed tonight is I'll be giving you evidence. You're going to be the ones, be the gentlemen and ladies of the jury who determine if anything I say provides proof for your own ideas. Now, Kilkenny was obviously one of the great areas in the War of Independence. And one of the great things about getting outside of Dublin when I give lectures is I do get a chance to go some research for the places where I'm going. You certainly never take a back seat in patriotism here in Kilkenny. And we can go way back if you want, but we can just start with, say, James Stephens. Somebody you probably know. He was born in Blackmall Street here in 1825. He's the founder of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. If it weren't for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, there would have been no Rising of 1916. And Peter de Lochary, of course you know him as your mayor going way back. He's the one who created the key, which Michael Collins got to De Valera, which got De Valera out of Lincoln Jail. So you know him all the way through this. And the county can also be found in a great number of witness statements that were filed in the 1940s and 1950s. There are 20 statements from men in there. Unfortunately, there are no statements from women at the time, which is really surprising because the women in Kilkenny really had a great role to play, particularly in the conscription crisis of 1918. But you have Frances Hackett, who was a member of the Kilkenny White Cross, and she submitted a great many things to the Bureau of Military History during the same time. And Hannah Dooley Murphy was the commandant of Commandant here. She did such a great job of keeping it secret that the British only thought there were maybe 70 persons, 70 women in Commandant at the time. But in fact, there were over 1,100. And in 1918, over 1,000 women signed the conscription the conscription papers against conscription. So Kilkenny was always there. And of course, William T. Cosgrave was elected from here in a by-election in 1917. One of the things I find most ironic and most important is something you probably know, but you may not know the exact aspects of it. And that was that Ernie O'Malley was captured here during the War of Independence in Kilkenny. What's ironic about that is that Ernie O'Malley was always going out from general headquarters in Dublin to the various counties and the various areas, and he was very, very critical. He was particularly critical of the leadership here in County Kilkenny. But he was having lunch one day, and he was captured with all of his notes, captured with everything that he had available to him. And the RIC and the British, the Black and Tans, when they found those, they found everything they needed to roll up the entire Kilkenny Brigade. That was Ernie O'Malley's contribution to the War of Independence in County Kilkenny. You don't read that in his book. When he was in prison, he was there with others, and he went by the name of Bernard Stewart. He had to. But he told them who he was, and they told him that he had ruined the entire Kilkenny Brigade. So as we discuss some of the broader aspects of the War of Independence and Civil War times thereafter, we look at the terror that it generated, and I can't tell you any more about Kilkenny than you probably know yourselves, but maybe I can give you some examples of how things happen all over the country. So let's start your questioning with Michael Collins, as Anna mentioned, because this is your first bit of jury duty, if you will. As in all cases, we always start with what we know, and then we go from there. One of the things I'm sure you all know when you walked in here tonight was that Michael Collins said that he signed his death warrant after he signed the treaty. Didn't he? It was supposed to be in response to Lord Birkenhead, who signed his actual death warrant, or his political death warrant. And Collins said, no, I signed my actual death warrant. But the first time we ever see that is in a book in 1939 by Birkenhead's daughter, because Birkenhead never confirmed he said it. And the first time we see the book about Michael Collins is in a book in 1958 by Rex Taylor, who said it wasn't said, but it was written to a man by the name of John O'Kane, who was supposed to be a Galway businessman who was doing business in London at the time. But there's no directory of John O'Kane in Galway, nor is there one in London. Taylor said he never saw the letter, but he knew where it was. It was in the possession of O'Kane's niece, Edna O'Kane. She's never been found. The letter has never been found. No one's ever seen this. No one's ever said that he said it. But you all thought he did. Why would Collins have said that on the 6th of December anyway? There was no indication at that time that there would be the conflict that was to come in the Civil War. That's what I mean when I take a look at the past. There's no evidence here that he said it or that he wrote it. So you're the jury. You have to take a look at things like this and determine what your evidence shows. We must always understand these accepted facts that we've formed as cornerstones of our belief, and we must ask them, are they really unlikely beliefs, or could they very well be true? But we have to determine if all these long-held beliefs are true, and they are facts, or whether they're just avoid being attacked with contrary arguments. Because, in fact, what we have to do is we have to determine our own history. And our history comes not so much from what has been told to us, but what we think is really actually true. In studying history, we find that very often interpretation defers to the political and the social prejudices of the time, and to the time it's written. If you look at books that were written in 1955, and look at books that were written in 1985, books that are written in 2015, you're going to find a very different interpretation of history. And that's good, because we always should take a look at the history and see how it's developing. Books often look at the big picture, but they don't necessarily look at the people. But history only takes shape through the lives of the ordinary people. People don't live history. They live their own lives. And that's what I try to do in my books and in talking tonight, talking about the people themselves. We must always try and break down history to what happened to the individual lives of people. Michael Collins, for example, said of the War of Independence that it was a struggle between two governments, the one proposed by the Irish and the other one, the British one, which was constantly losing ground. The war was fought to bring Ireland its own native government, and it was done so through the actions of people. Many people you know their names, many people you've never heard of, but they all made great contributions to history at the time. So when we look at the War of Independence, we're going to look at military action to be sure. But we look at in the place of the context of the war, and in the context of Irish society as well, because what was its conduct and what was its effect on society, and particularly on the women. So I will continue with an examination of the Irish War, how it was pursued by both sides, the terror of the period, and then the effects on those who lived through it, because there are very, very many effects which we don't think about now, but had a great deal of influence upon how the Irish were formed. Too often in reviewing Irish history, we look at it as black and white. We did it, they didn't. They did it, we didn't. That type of thing. Those black and white kind of things, binary constructs, are usually wrong. History is not a binary sort of a thing. It's not black and white. And in order to understand history, we must understand that it's very nuanced. In fact, both sides, for example, committed a great deal of terror during the whole war. Both sides. It's important to understand what happened on either side. Collins, in particular, evolved into a realist. In 1917, he was always thought of as the physical force man. He was the physical force man in 1917. But later he became much more concerned about the shaping public opinion and the political impact of violence. The function of the military in the Irish War of Independence and even the Irish flying columns was not to defeat the British militarily. They could not have done so. Tom Barry said, "The objective of a flying column is not to fight, but to continue to exist." And that's exactly what happens in all guerrilla warfares. Usually the guerrilla is fighting on the wrong foot all the time. The status quo government has a great deal much more military power. But if the guerrilla can continue to exist, the war can't continue itself. Collins and the Irish really wanted to wear out the British. They wanted to drain the British ability to fight, but also drain the British political will to fight. That was probably more important. Those guerrillas who have succeeded, if you will, I don't say they win the War of Independence, but they have succeeded in the War of Independence, do not necessarily win in a military sense. They succeed when the invader or the oppressor or the autocrat has to recognize the guerrillas and at least to some degree partially recognizes their political desires. That's what happened in Ireland in 1919 and 1921. So why was the IRA effective? Well, the Irish were responding to the demands of the people itself. In order to succeed for a victory in the War of Independence, they had to give a better government to the people. In the 1960s, there was a historian named Bernard Fall, and what he wrote was, "A government losing an insurgency is not being out-administered or not being outfought, it is being out-administered." The Irish did that. They won the propaganda political war. They succeeded militarily. So within the framework of succeeding this and changing from a British government to an Irish government, the Irish had two essential objectives. One was to frustrate the British military, the RIC, the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries. But secondarily, and maybe more important, assuming government functions that the British used to control them. For example, the Dáil itself, or the Dáil Republican courts, which became much more effective than the British courts themselves. The Irish replacement quasi-government really marginalized the British government, and that caused the erosion of public support. We must always understand that overshadowing the Irish military was the Irish political view. They had to win the political view in order to succeed. Politics is about principle, it's about power, it's about persuasion, and persuasion is the most important element. Not only must successful guerrillas succeed politically and militarily, but they must succeed politically as well. And it's only when they have that kind of political success that they can change things. The purely military effects of any guerrilla war are always subordinate to the political and the psychological effects, and that's exactly what happened in the Irish War of Independence. And the British knew this. Before the war even started, the Chief Secretary, Henry Duke, in early 1918 said, "The determination of the Sinn Féin leaders is to make administration impossible." Later on that year, Walter Long, who was the head of the British Civil Service at the time, said, "It's a fight between the government and Sinn Féin to see who is going to govern the country." Before the war started, they knew what it was. So Britain was always one step behind the evolving Irish political situation. The British never knew the Irish. Augustin Birrell, who was the Chief Secretary at the time of the Rising, said, "I always thought that I was very ignorant of what was going on in the mines and in the cellars, if you like, of the Dublin population." And he was. And the people in Dublin Castle all the way through the time were as well. There were many in Dublin Castle who simply did not know exactly what was going on in the Irish mind. One of those things, for example, was in 1918 that I mentioned, the conscription crisis, in which so many women here in Kilkenny participated. No one in 1918 was conscripted from Ireland. In fact, no one from Ireland was ever conscripted. But that fear of conscription was never far from the Irish mind. That 1918 threat, at least temporarily, united the two factions, the militant and the moderate. Nothing could have been done then to more popularize Sinn Féin and to bring the moderates and the militants together, and this created a physical force that the British could not handle. No Irishman was ever conscripted, but that threat of conscription was the most important thing in 1918 until the elections. Now, Winston Churchill never did anything for Ireland, really, but he's always good for a quotation. And one of his is, you never let a good crisis go to waste. And the Irish did a very good job. So if we jump ahead then to July and December of 1921, to the military and political action come together in the truce and the treaty, we find out how the Irish succeeded. Another military historian by the name of Michael Howard observed, war in the 20th century was not, as it had been in the past, a conflict between the armed forces alone or even between the treasuries. It's between the willpower and the morale of the belligerent populations. The Irish won the propaganda war. They may have succeeded militarily, but they won the propaganda war. There were effective limits on what the British population would accept. They would no longer accept any of the reprisals, the murders, the killings that were getting such publicity internationally. That is when the Irish won the war. Another man, Clemenceau, always said, war is much too important to be left to the military. And he's right. One cannot solve a political problem with military force. Not then and not now. You cannot solve a political problem with military force. One must balance completing interests, and you must accept that sometimes political expediency is necessary. The Irish great achievement was maneuvering the British into a hopeless political dilemma, and not in eliminating their forces. But they won the propaganda war. And as the war began to go on, the British began to appreciate that. And at one time, the British would do anything just to get out of Ireland because they knew that the Irish had won the hearts and minds of the people here. When we talk about terror in the war, it's a very controversial term. We don't like the word term because it's always very difficult for us to understand what is exactly happening and by whom. At a very small area, the first idea is to perhaps throw a grenade into a police barracks or something like that. But as it moves up, terror goes into the idea of eliminating the other forces, eliminating the political and military forces that they had. And that's exactly what the IRA did. Leadership targeting sometimes is called, or selective assassination. Todd Andrews, when he wrote his book Dublin Made Me, said, assassination, correctly applied by Michael Collins, was the real basis of our relative success. So terror is a very difficult thing to talk about. But we must understand that it was done by both sides. First of all, when we talk about terror, we think of the black and tans and the auxiliaries. They're two separate entities, but they're often confused. But Tom Barry did differentiate between the two of them. He said the general feeling here in Ireland at the time was that the black and tans were the worst. But he went on and said, but the auxiliaries were something else. They were far worse than the black and tans. He said, I have no doubt a few of them could pass as ordinary decent men, but the vast majority were the worst that the British ever came. And Patrick O'Shea defined them even better. He said, they had neither religion nor morals. They used foul language. They stole from each other. They sneered at the customs of the country. They drank to excess, and they put sugar on their porridge. Collins was very deeply conscious all the way through of the suffering of the Irish. But he realized that these kind of inflammatory tactics must take place. He viewed the black and tans, the auxiliaries, and the terror that followed them as sort of a mixed blessing. Apart from the loss, he said that the attacks entailed, good is done as it makes clear and clearer to people what both sides stand for. But the black and tans and the auxiliaries shouldn't be the only ones we think of when we think of terror, because terror was done by both sides. Done by whom? We have to ask that question all the time. It's very often hard to look at terror and determine that our own forces did the same sort of thing. But the purpose of terror is to disturb the functions of ordinary people. The United Nations even now says that the purpose of terror is to disturb the goals of the lives and liberties of people. But insurgents and counterinsurgents and terrorists often have to balance persuasion and coercion. And coercion is often necessary in any rebellion, and the rebels vie with the government for the minds and the hearts and the minds of the people. All rebels require assistance. If they don't get it, they cannot succeed. And in order to get that, sometimes they have to use terrorism. Those who decide not to help at least must be determined and hindered so they do not harm you. Collins said, careful application of terrorism is also an excellent form of communication. It must be emphasized that terror, burnings, murders, shearing women's hair we'll talk about, was done by both sides, both the IRA and by the British. Charles Townsend once said the IRA could win a burning contest at any time. So Collins always stressed the minimum force necessary to achieve his political objectives. Above all, he was a realist. And time again we find that. He was concerned about shaping public opinion and the political impact of violence and terror. When Collins organized a squad, its first meeting was in September of 1919. And about 20 or 30 men attended that meeting, but many said that they could not kill in cold blood. Collins knew that violence would be necessary, but it had to be controlled. But some of the comments of those who were willing to join the squad are really very telling. You may have seen Vinnie Byrne. He gave TV interviews until he was a very old man. He said, "It was the joy of my life when I was handed a .45 revolver and 6 rounds, because I loved plugging British soldiers." Joe Dolan said, "We had to learn to kill in cold blood," and we did. That same Tom Barry, when he went off to join the British Army in the First World War, said that he didn't do so because he was fighting for small nations or for Irish independence. He didn't know anything about that. He said, "I knew nothing about nations, large or small, or home rule. I went to war for no other reason than I wanted to see what war was like, to get a gun and feel like a real man." Some of the things that they say are rather chilling. There's a real cavalier attitude sometimes to the actions of the Irish. So as we discuss terror and trauma, we must consider the nature of the terror and what it does upon those who it's committed, but what it does upon those who commit it as well. What happened to those who did so and their families and the people who were killed? What was the effect? Let's take a look at just one of the events here in County Kilkenny that might give you an idea of the kind of thing that was going on. There was a man by the name of John Walsh. He filled out a witness statement in 1950. And he was the officer commanding here of the Kilkenny Brigade. At that time, they found an ex-British soldier who was giving information to the Devonshire regiment that just had moved into here. That British soldier's name was Kenny. And they had found out that he was giving this information, and they took him aside, and they found money in his pockets, and they found a ticket to Canada in his pockets. And they had a trial. And they determined he was going to be a spy, so he should be executed. But they found out that if they shot him, the British would hear the shots, and the British might come and capture them as well. So instead of shooting him, Walsh wrote that what we did was we tried him by court-martial. He had no defense to offer, and he was sentenced to be executed. We gagged and blindfolded him, and having bound his arms and legs, we dropped him into the river Barrow, at a point just yards from the eel house. But his witness statement was very explicit. He said the water at that point would be 8 or 10 feet deep, so as an additional precaution, we attached 56-pound weights to his body before he threw him in the river. And about 2 months later, his decomposed body was washed ashore, and I had the gruesome task of again tying weights and heavy stones to his body and dropping him into the river for the second time. And he concludes his witness statement by saying, "We had no further problem with spies in the area." We should always ask what explains the excess of terror and counter-terror in the war. What explains the differences on how men and women are terrorized, and how are they treated by society and medically? These kinds of questions are not always popular, but we understand conflict when we understand what happens when people confront one another and they go out to kill one another. Physical injury and mental anguish bring with them uniquely different problems. Individually, they can cripple, but when you put them together, they create tremendous psychological trauma. Both sides use terror intentionally and strategically, and terror does not end at the event. After the war ended, the effects lingered on long after the war ended. For those who suffered through the trauma of the times, the trauma was compounded by one on another. The terror war ended, but for many, the trauma did not. When I was in the Army and since, I studied the effects of violence and terror and their lasting effects. Knut Hansen is one of my heroes. He was one of the heroes of the Norwegian resistance in the Second World War. And he wrote that Warriors deserve our gratitude and support. Wars can bring adventures that stir the heart. But the truth is that war is composed of individual tragedies of grief, waste, and sacrifice. We can always recognize the justice of the cause, but we also have to admit the cost. And I think the words of Sebastian Barry are just hard to improve upon. He wrote, "We may or may not damn all sides of that era equally, but we must be prepared to acknowledge sins committed by those with whom we agree, as well as those with whom we disagree." Let's move on a little bit to the proclamation, some of the laws that happened after the War of Independence. And I want to particularly emphasize the treatment of women in those documents and the treatment of women in society at that time, because that's something that we just don't see in most history books. In all the books I've written, I've tried to do so, not because I'm a feminist, but because I'm an egalitarian. I really believe that if anybody does something, they should get credit for it, no matter what their sex or their gender. We should do that well. But very often in history books, women are written out. There's a great difference in life in the years before the proclamation, before the Rising. It was said the quality of life was different than the life of the quality. So as we study what followed even here tonight, we must ask, how many of the women in particular were disappointed with what happened after the War of Independence and the Civil War? Employment for the time was really unbelievable. James Connell's description of the women as slave of slaves was really pretty apt. And I don't understand those who at the time write in their books that women for the first time entered the workforce in World War I. What did they think the women were doing with a house full of children in those tenement homes? But during World War I, women did move out of the home for the first time. And they were given great opportunities, but not opportunities of the kind that you might think. We have here, even in County Kilkenny, you have Claire Cragen, who became Wilbur Hobson's wife, and Kitty O'Doherty and Dr. Josephine Stallard Clark. They all came and carried dispatches back and forth. During the Rising itself, Dr. Kathleen Lynn surrendered the City Hall garrison, and she founded St. Ultan's Children's Hospital. The proclamation was signed in Jenny Weiss Power's home there in Dublin, and her husband was a lawyer, and he was in the volunteers, but they told him not to go out for the Rising. He'd be more successful afterwards helping out the people in the IRB. But it was not John, it was Kathleen Clark who was given the role of revitalizing the IRB after the Rising. She was very, very important. And all these women, all very highly qualified, none of them were ever nominated for the First Oil. Kathleen Clark was noted for her IRB work. She did the Irish Volunteers Dependence Fund. Michael Collins and Joe McGraw worked for her, not the other way around. And the constituency in North Dublin wanted to nominate her to the First Oil. But Harry Boland and Dermot O'Hagerty wanted Richard Mulcahy to be nominated. So Boland and O'Hagerty went to the constituency chairman and said, "We want Richard Mulcahy." And the constituency chairman said, "No, we know her. She lives here. We want her to be nominated as our representative." But Boland said, "Well, she's already been nominated in Limerick, her hometown. The election materials have already been printed. She's surely going to be elected there." So finally, the constituency relented and they did nominate Richard Mulcahy. But Boland knew she had not been nominated in Limerick. There were no election materials. She was not nominated in the First Oil. She, of course, was nominated for the Second Oil and she became the first female Lord Mayor of Dublin. But this is how women were kept away from decision-making positions. The ability to make decisions, to implement them, is not a gender-specific trait. It's a common human one. And we should understand that. Charles Townsend once said that the women in the Rising had peripheral tasking. I think that's patronizing, and I think it's wrong. I think Helena Maloney's description is far better. She wrote, "I feel you might as well ask me what did tall men do and what did small men do. My answer in both cases is the same. They did what they came to do with their hands day to day, and whatever they were capable of doing, they did." I think that's the best description. Now, I want to just touch on a couple of documents around that period. First of all, we have to start with the proclamation, of course. It's a beautiful document. It's written a great deal by Pierce, but Connolly had an awful lot of social input into it. And we should read it every once in a while. But remember when you do read that every time you see the word Irish men, that's immediately followed by the words Irish women. That's the first time the first mention of gender equality during the period. And it's a beautiful document, as I say, but it's an aspirational document. It was meant to go in effect. So we have 4 documents, though, on the first Doyle that were going to be the law of the land going after that. There was a Declaration of Independence. It was short. It was only 403 words. Republic was mentioned 3 times. Equality in women and sex was never mentioned. There's the Constitution. It was short, too. It was 663 words. Equality, women, and sex was never mentioned. There was a democratic program, which was sort of giving to labor a little bit of an input into it. It was the only mention in the first Doyle of any kind of equality. That democratic program said, we affirm it is the duty of the nation to assure that every citizen has the opportunity to spend his or her strength and faculties in the service of the people. That was the only mention of gender in the first Doyle. Let's jump to the 1922 Constitution. This had the largest electoral roll in Ireland at the time, but it was still discriminated. A woman couldn't vote unless she was over 30, a man over 21, or over 18 if he had served in the First World War. This was not aspirational. These documents were law going forward. And the Constitution's drafting really caused some great problems between the treaty and the anti-treaty forces, because Collins was trying to, quote, work the treaty as he always said. He always said it was going to be a stepping stone. And during the treaty debates, he told Kathleen Clark, I don't expect you to vote for the treaty. I only hope if it's passed, you help me work it. Because Collins and Griffin wanted to push back on some of the concessions they made in signing the treaty, particularly in the role of the Crown in the government. If they could marginalize the Crown in this Constitution, much of the cause of the split on the anti-treaty side would be removed. But the British believed they were not getting a return on their concessions, and the British were sufficiently angry that they said they would go back to war if the Constitution wasn't changed. So Collins and Griffin had to do so, because Lloyd George told the Parliament that it was a complete evasion and negation of the treaty. He gave a Republican disguise. Winston Churchill threatened the Irish in the Parliament. He said, we will go back to war over this if you do not put the king and the oath back into it. The Irish blinked first, but they had to do so. But when Collins saw the constitutions that came out, he knew he probably couldn't avoid the Civil War. It was only published on the 16th of June, so it was very late. Though it was not a Republican Constitution, what was in that final draft with regard to women? Article 3 said, every person without distinction of sex is a citizen of the Irish Free State and shall enjoy the privileges and be subject to the obligations of such citizenship. Full stop. There were no gender-related restrictions regarding government in the plain language of the 1922 Constitution. Let me reread that just a second. And every person without distinction of sex is a citizen of the Irish Free State and shall enjoy the privileges and be subject to the obligations of such citizenship. Despite the fact that it was not a Republican Constitution, all women should have felt that they could enter the Free State with great expectations of full citizenship. The 1922 Constitution was probably the most gender-equal constitution in Irish history. It really was an attempt to accommodate the rights and concerns of all. But quickly that changed. The Constitution proved ineffective in protecting the vision of equal rights. In the 1920s, the Cumming and Gahill government, led by Cosgrave, and in the 1930s, the Fianna Fáil government, led by Amy de Valera, had all kinds of laws which determined to put women back into a domestic role, always. Let's take a look at just a couple of things of early legislation. There was the Juries Act of 1924, which said that every woman can opt out if she wants to be exempt from jury duty, an opt-out clause. Not enough women opted out. So the Juries Act of 1927 said women were exempted but entitled to serve if they applied to do so. It's an opt-in clause, which really takes advantage of the natural human inertia of human beings. If we have to do something, we don't do it. The intent was to have fewer women on the juries. So there was a deliberate legislative intent and policy to minimize women on the juries because it was incompatible with their home duties and their sensitive dispositions. They weren't so sensitive they couldn't be tried for a crime. They weren't so sensitive they couldn't be witnesses, but they were too sensitive to be on jury. That discrimination became more and more often. Women began to be restricted in terms of careers. We have the Civil Service Regulation Bill in 1925, and then a marriage bar in 1932, and then the Conditions of Employment Bill in 1935. These were laws that ordained that only unmarried women or widows could serve jobs in teaching and civil service. This was a limitation on women in public life. So now we can see the treatment of sexes. It starts very early in the Free State, not as equals, but deliberately. And it obviously indicates a shift. But it's important to know that during those very, very same years, non-governmental entities did not have such restrictions. In 1925, Unakio became the very first female member of a stock exchange anywhere in the world when she became a member here. Article 3 of the Constitution of 1922 are not perfect. And they really they proved ineffective in the aspirations of equality for the women. But that 1922 Constitution was a very important point in respect to rights of women in Ireland. And many examples of retrogressive legislation were passed, but still it's important to look back on it. The 1922 Constitution was the most gender-equal constitution in Irish history. Now I just want to touch very briefly on one aspect of the 1937 Constitution. And it took years for any constitution to be developed at that time. This one started in 1935. The primary drafters, of course, were Eamon de Valera and John Hearn. John Hearn was an attorney who was a legal advisor to the Department of External Affairs. That's now called Foreign Affairs. Hearn was primarily responsible for putting the language together, and he was very broadly egalitarian and very liberal at the time. In his 1935 draft, the first draft of the Constitution, he had this equality clause. All citizens are equal before the law, period. Full stop. But that didn't stay that way. In the equality section of the 1937 Constitution, it was finally passed this way. Article 40.1. All citizens shall, as human persons, be held equal before the law. This shall not be held to mean that the state shall not, in its enactments, have due regard to the differences of capacity, physical and moral, and of social function. Whenever I read that, I think of George Orwell in Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. I mentioned the Juries Act. The Juries Act stayed that way until 1979. This equality clause, it's still there. That's the current Irish constitutional clause. Many historians claim there was little objection, and I don't understand that either, because women's organizations contested a great deal of this. They went back and said gender equality comes out of the proclamation. What happened to this? They proposed a society based on merit, not on any kind of patriarchal principles. They objected to the language, and they objected very strongly. And Shishi Skeffington wrote that the 1916 proclamation gave women equal citizenship, equal rights, and equal opportunities. This constitution had filched these, or smothered them in mere empty formulae. And Dorothy McCardle, who was very much of a supporter of de Valera, wrote to him and said, I don't see how anyone holding advanced views on the rights of women can support this. And that's a tragic dilemma, because those have been loyal and ardent workers in the national cause for years. There was a conference in Lissadell in 1917, and it looked at the roles of women in the period and asked why within a generation had women been written out of history and been often so forgotten in the books that were written. When I gave my presentation, I went further than that. And I said, it's not just that the women were written out of history, but in many cases and in many attempts, they tried to be written out of society. And they were. In this discussion, I want to emphasize these entities or these laws were passed by all sides. The lack of women in the First Oil was under the original Sinn Féin. The Juries Acts of the 1920s were under Cumann na Gael, which was the precursor of Fine Gael. And the Constitution of 1937 was passed when Fianna Fáil was in power. Simply, women were intentionally left out. Intentionally. Now, some historians have called this paternalistic conservatism. That's a phrase that they use, and they define it in this way. Paternalism is an approach to governing a country in which members of the elite govern in the best interests of the people. Some members of society lead others because they are not able to lead themselves. Not able to lead themselves. Once we get through the period of time, we have to take a look at what happened during that period of time. And perhaps there should never be revolutions or rebellions, but when they happen, those who fight often fall out among themselves. There's an old adage that revolutions devour their children. One of the major problems in guerrilla wars is what happens after regime change. Order does not come out of chance. Somebody has to design it. They have to make it. And during that short-term period between 1916 and 1923, there were no really short-term goals for the Irish. Military and propaganda goals, victories, yes, but there were no long-term solutions. No one really understood exactly how they were going to govern when they came out of that period of time. The leaders at the time were very conservative nationalists. For example, Kevin O'Higgins stated in Doyle once, "I think we're probably the most conservative-minded revolutionaries who've ever put through a conservative revolution." A conservative revolution. To me, that's oxymoronic. I don't understand how it can be. What has to be understood is that the Irish national movement really didn't have any overall economic or social agenda besides a desire for self-rule. Freedom from the British government alone was thought to be the sole end in itself, and little or no thought and certainly no preparation was given to what was going to happen afterwards. This didn't seem to matter much until after the January of 1922 when the treaty went into effect. There's a man by the name of Vincent Gookin who was actually a surveyor in 17th century Ireland, and he wrote one time, "The unsettling of a nation is easy work, but the settling of a nation is not." It really begs the question, to me anyway, were the Irish participants rebels? Were they simply fighting to remove British government? Or were they revolutionaries with a clear concept of the society they wished to achieve? Felix Larkin wrote that there was a social revolution in Ireland, though it occurred before the political revolution. The revolution of 1912-1923 was the end of a process of change in Ireland, not the beginning. Those 1920 separatists really showed little inclination to experiment with new institutional forms. They were not socialist ideologues, and for the most part they were fighting for a society whose basic premises they accepted. Peter O'Donnell wrote, "All the leadership wanted was a change from British to Irish government. They wanted no change in the basis of society. It was a political, not a social revolution." I walk by one every day in a hotel, near the hotel where I stay. A green mailbox with VR on the top of it. I'm sure you have them here too. There was a change in the political order that avoided any kind of rupture in the social relations. That's why many, including myself, call it a revolution without a revolution. Who ruled Ireland underwent some change, but how Ireland ruled was really not radically different. We must ask, how did life change for the average person in 1922? The farmer, the nurse, the carter, the worker here in a shop on Kieran Street. There were 80,000 persons living in tenements in such kind of housing in 1923. How much changed for them? There's always a gap between a patriotic ideal and a pragmatic deal. In many respects, the Irish Free State is a reminder of the disconnect between the ideals of rebellion and independence and the realities of governing. To paraphrase Seamus Heaney, he said the Free State leaders were subsumed by the crassness of reality. Once in a while, if you ever get up to Dublin, I'm sure you've gone to the Garden of Remembrance. And there's a quotation there. "In the darkness and despair, we saw a vision. We saw the light of hope, and it was not extinguished. In the desert of discouragement, we saw a vision. We planted the tree of valor, and it blossomed. O generations of freedom, remember us, the generations of the vision." We should remember all the men and women, the ones whose names you remember and the ones whose names are not in the books, but without whom that struggle for independence would never have occurred. I start out today by saying we should separate the men and the women and the myths and examine accepted facts and beliefs. but we must determine if these beliefs that we have can withstand the scrutiny of time. And maybe it's appropriate to bring this summation to the same way. Because the men and women of those times don't need any mythologizing. They need no elaboration. There are many heroes of the times, but they are uncomfortable heroes to some. In every war, particularly guerrilla wars, both sides commit outrageous acts, and the Irish War was no different. Collins and the others were not saints. He said his methods were the only way a small nation can fight an empire. But Collins knew that peace would be achieved eventually, and it's just at what price. He also knew the Irish would have to talk to the British sooner or later. And the most wise people always do their talking sooner rather than later. Collins understood what could be achieved by military and what could be achieved politically. And he was always going toward that period. Throughout the period, the people of Ireland, they acted like ordinary people. They were ordinary people. Some were brave, some were cowardly, some were generous, and some were mean. As extraordinary as the things they did and accomplished, they were very ordinary people. In the words of one historian, they were plain people caught up in the mad whirl of revolution. The remarkable thing is not that they didn't succeed completely, but that they succeeded to the degree that they did. And remember, they didn't live history, they lived their lives. My biggest hope for anyone, for all of you who are studying history, is that you remember the sacrifices that were made. They were made by the men, the women, the children, even everybody who was involved were affected by this era. And they weren't just statistics. They were people just like you. I quoted Oscar Wilde at the beginning when I said, truth is simply the opinion that has survived. But historians often say that history is what the evidence obliges us to believe. I disagree with that. I disagree with the idea that history obliges us to believe anything. I think that's up to you. I think you should be the ones who determine what the evidence shows. And you determine history. Whenever I gave legal seminars, I always ended by misquoting Buddha. I said, believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, even if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense. And I think that's the best advice to learning any history. I would say to you, having studied this and having studied Collins for so many years, I know that when he was a young man and he moved to London, as a 16-year-old, he always kept a pocket diary. And he kept that for the rest of his life. He wrote everything in there. He wrote appointments, he wrote people, he wrote everything in there. But on the last day he died, one of the things he wrote was, the people are splendid. And you are. And every one of you has welcomed me to Ireland for all these years with the greatest hospitality. And I thank you. And I thank you for letting me come to see you tonight. Thank you very much.
We all have to do a lot of thinking and questioning everything that we have been led to believe, I suppose, and it's a good thing, I think. And I think war is a dreadful thing, no matter what side you're on. And I quote a little thing I remember from a German graveyard in France, and it said, there are no heroes buried here, only sons, and probably daughters and children. And that's the way war is, and it shouldn't be. And we'll have to have another look, Joe, at the way we view things. And we'll let you go home and cool down. Thanks a million for coming out. It's really cool.